All throughout Canada, a sizable handful of older folks claim to have seen a show titled The Big Room. At least, that's the most common title people use. Other people remember it being called In the Big Room, or A Big Room, or some variation of those titles. Here are the accounts I've collected from people who have talked about it. Supposedly, the first known record of this show was in Toronto in the early 1950s, and the last known record was in Vancouver in the early 1980s. It never aired on any one specific TV station, but would instead air on random stations depending on the date, and would only be broadcast on one or a few specific TVs at a time. Every single episode of the show was in black and white, even after the majority of the country had switched to color. What was the show about? Most testimonies agree it consisted of a large cast of characters getting into silly antics in a large room. No two episodes would have the exact same characters, but supposedly the cast consisted of a mix of puppets and people in costumes. Reports of the cast themselves vary, but the most consistent descriptions include a woman with a cartoonishly large nose, a person in a rubber cow mask who spoke entirely in mooing, a monkey puppet with gross human teeth, a person in an unsettling white rabbit costume, a man whose face was a smooth white mask with two black eyes and a smiling black mouth, a bird-like puppet with messy feathers, and the disembodied talking head of a teenage girl mounted on the wall like a stuffed deer. Due to the presence of Japanese text in some episodes, some speculated the show was of Japanese origin, though this was never confirmed. It's also worth noting that the show had only been viewed by children, and never by adults or teens. None of the reported viewers had been over the age of 12 when they had watched it. But what makes this show so infamous, and why so many people talk about it despite there being no footage or evidence of it existing, is the ending of each episode. At the end of each episode, the cast would all turn to the camera and thank the viewers. And then, they would name drop the specific person watching right then. If there was more than one person in the room, the cast would mention all of their names too. Some children were frightened by this. Others found it flattering and didn't realize the horror of the situation until they had grown up. I first heard about this show from my mother when she was telling me about some of the shows she watched back when she was a child in the 70s. I didn't think too much of The Big Room at the time. Sure, it was a little weird that a show somehow knew the name of my mom and her brother, but it must have just been a weird coincidence, or the result of distorted memories. It wasn't until I decided to look up the show out of curiosity that I started to become weirded out. There was no IMDb or Wikipedia page for the show, and CBC had no mention of it on any of their sites. I did, however, find a very compelling forum thread about it, so I immediately clicked. The thread was mostly filled with younger people closer to my age who had heard about the show from their older relatives, though there were a few older users who claimed to have seen it themselves. The more I read through the thread and learned about the show, the more interested I became. That was half a year ago, and ever since then, I've been asking around, both online and in person, to see if I can find anyone else who's seen this show, or knows someone who's seen it. A lot of people I spoke to insisted this show wasn't real, and that it was the result of a bunch of collective false memories, or maybe even an elaborate ARG. But I still believed in it. Even if there was no evidence of this show anywhere, surely there were too many eyewitness testimonies out there to write it off as a hoax, right? I've always had a thing for lost media, and this was one of the most fascinating examples I knew of. My biggest breakthrough came when I spoke to Erin, one of my closest friends, about it. We were chatting over at our local coffee shop, and I decided to tell her about my search for The Big Room. As I described what I heard about the show to her, she just kind of casually nodded for the most part. But as soon as I mentioned the person with the cow mask, Erin's eyes flew open and her lower jaw dropped.
"Holy fish,"
Erin said.
"My dad mentioned having an aunt who wore a cow mask and worked on a kid show, and I completely forgot about it until now."
We didn't hesitate. Erin drove me right over to her parents' house to speak to her father, Paul. Erin told her father that I wanted to know more about the aunt who wore the cow mask. He wondered why I was so curious about that weird old memory, but decided it wouldn't hurt to talk about it anyway. Paul explained that he knew very little about this aunt of his, and didn't even remember her name. He heard she had worked on a kid show, but didn't know what the show was called and never saw any episodes of it. The aunt very rarely came over to their house, never more than once a year, but when she did, he was always insistent on wearing the cow mask, so he had no idea what her face looked like. And she never ever spoke, instead making mooing sounds. He always thought she was weird, but usually didn't think much about her between each visit. Paul then told me his aunt passed away in the early 80s, which I realized conveniently lined up with when the big room was last seen. After she died, Paul's family was given the aunt's cow mask by the coroners, and they've kept it in a box in the closet ever since. I began to quiver with excitement. My friend's family actually had a prop from the long-lost kid show I was looking for. I politely asked if I could see it. He said yes. In fact, I could keep it. He had no use for that old cow mask anymore. I couldn't thank Paul enough. As soon as he handed me the box, I grabbed it from him and continued to thank him, even after I walked out the front door. On the drive home, Erin congratulated me on my find, then told me that she had an appointment today and unfortunately wouldn't be there to open the box with me. However, she said I could send her photos, since she was just as curious to see it as I was. I promised I would, before thanking her as she dropped me off at my house and drove away. In my bedroom, I opened up the box and pulled out the item inside. An ordinary-looking rubber cow mask that was in surprisingly good condition for something that had apparently been created back in the 50s. I turned the mask over in my hands a few times as my excitement slowly waned. Couldn't help but wonder if this prop was legit or not. There was nothing to confirm it wasn't just a generic cow mask bought from a local store recently. Maybe Erin and her father were just playing some kind of prank on me. If it was a prank, then it was an unbelievably elaborate one, given that Erin didn't seem to know about the show before I told her, and there would have been no way for her to tell her father in the time she drove me to the house. I took a few photos of the mask from different angles, promising myself to send them to Erin and post them online soon. I then decided maybe a photo or two of myself wearing the mask would also be fun to see. I put it on, surprised by how comfortable it was for something so old and cheap looking. After taking a few selfies from both the front and side, I reached up to pull the mask off my face, but it wouldn't budge. For some reason, the mask felt a lot tighter on my skin and a lot warmer than when I had first put it on. The harder I tugged with both hands, the more it hurt, as if I was pulling on my own skin instead of a rubber covering. I began to panic and hyperventilate as the mask heated up more and more, until it felt like I had a fever. The room began to sway as I felt dizzy and nauseous. I wanted to vomit before realizing that would make things worse. Sweat formed on my skin and my face began to itch like crazy, but the mask prevented me from scratching or wiping the sweat away. I grabbed my phone and desperately began to text Erin for help. However, the phone began to ring while I was in the middle of typing the message. It said the call was from the big room, even though I didn't have that number anywhere in my contacts. I answered it anyway, just out of curiosity.
"Hi, Kelly,"
said a male voice that sounded pre-recorded. My hands trembled and I felt like puking again. How did this man know my name? The voice continued.
"We are really happy to have you as a part of the big room. We unfortunately had to end the show a long time ago after one of our favorite cast members, Miss Moo the Cow Lady, passed away. However, now that you've agreed to become the new Miss Moo, we can safely say that our show will now be resuming production very soon. And don't worry about your friend Erin. We'll find a part for her as well. We'll be coming over tonight to pick you up. Until then, moo your heart away, Kelly."
As soon as the message ended, the caller hung up. I was terrified and confused. I had a million questions dancing through my brain.
What the hell is going on?
I screamed out loud to no one in particular. At least, that's what I tried to say. All that came out was a loud mooing sound. Losing a loved one is never easy. People often delude themselves into thinking that it's all about the death, but it's so much more. To start, something feels off. That leads to a series of appointments and tests. Next comes the diagnosis, Family and friends offer up condolences and support, all while feeling powerless inside. Sometimes there's a gradual decline, other times it's over quick. There are those who don't want to lose their loved ones, and those who don't want to let them suffer. Some of them say what they mean, but the others are just trying to mask their true feelings. There's always a decline in faculties, then somewhere between inevitable and unexpected, the loved one dies. But that's not the last of it. If the tragedy of loss weren't enough, agony is multiplied by logistics. When will the service be held, and where? Will it be religious or secular? Who's going to give the eulogy or do the reading? What are we going to feed people? After all those questions are answered, the bill comes. Once the memorial is finished, the estate has to be handled, with some people walking away satisfied, while others are disappointed. Sometimes there's nothing left after the medical expenses and funeral costs. Last but not least, something needs to be done with the deceased belongings. Memories and treasures become things to be fought over or thrown into a dumpster. If there's a house, it probably needs to be sold. Grief isn't allowed to truly set in until the dust settles. My girlfriend Whitney was devastated by the loss of her grandfather Jim. Her parents died when their house burned to the ground. Jim saved her from the fire himself, but he couldn't get her parents out in time. Jim officially took her in after the memorial. It wasn't hard for him to get custody. He was a decorated detective who was known for volunteering around the community. Her aunt breathed a sigh of relief.
What was I supposed to do with a 12-year-old girl?
She asked.
Love her. Cherish her. Take care of her.
He said. Jim loved carpentry. To help his granddaughter acclimate to her new home, he handcrafted her new furniture. They painted her room purple and filled it with toys and the furniture Jim made. Even though Whitney was still mourning her parents, he had found home again. She accompanied him on all his errands and social visits. They would go around town, helping the elderly, mentoring school children, and giving handcrafted gifts to expecting parents. Jim did his best to give Whitney a normal home life. Being a detective made it difficult sometimes. Long hours out investigating meant a lot of nights spent alone, but Jim always made sure the fridge was stocked, her homework was done, and the house was locked up tight. Sometimes Jim brought his work home with him. One time she went into the room he used as an office. She told me about a wall covered in newspaper clippings and police reports. When she asked him what the things on the wall were, Jim simply said it was his life's work. She pressed him about the stories on the wall, but he told her she shouldn't know about such things. He ushered her out and asked her to stay out of the office.
The world out there can get pretty hairy. You're too young to know about such things, let alone worry about them. Leave it to us detectives, okay?
She never pressed him about his work again. Whitney introduced me to Jim at a picnic 2 months after we started dating. I was expecting an overprotective, rough cop sort. Instead, we hit it off right away. We spent that afternoon talking about his carpentry and what I did for a living. When the picnic started to wind down, Jim took me aside.
Now listen,
Jim said.
You seem like a really nice guy, and I'm glad Whitney finally brought you around. But if you ever hurt her...
I would never hurt her. Not to mention, she's pretty tough. I don't think I could even if I wanted to.
Jim smiled and clapped me on the back.
Good man.
A weekly dinner visit became part of our norm. Jim knew his way around the grill. His barbecue chicken was to die for, but his chili recipe was in a league of its own. I asked him for the recipe once. After it was evident that I wasn't going anywhere, he decided I was worthy. No matter how many times I made it though, it never tasted the same as his. As time went on, Whitney and I needed to take over culinary duties for our weekly dinners. Jim started to complain about his old joints. He was constantly going on about headaches and a stiff neck. As his joints got worse, his sense of balance started to go too. Jim took a turn for the worse one night, when we were having ribs. He grabbed his lemonade but spilled it all over himself. The glass fell to the hardwood floor and shattered to pieces. He struggled to pick the pieces from the floor. Whitney and I told him we would clean it up. When Jim got up to show us where the broom was, he wobbled a little bit. After a few steps, he collapsed onto the floor. Whitney and I rushed over to help him. We called the paramedics, and half an hour later, we were getting him checked in at the ER. The doctors thought that Jim was suffering from a neurological condition. but nothing was conclusive until they ran more tests. They kept him overnight for observation, then released him to us the next morning. It was evident that arrangements had been made for his care. Whitney was insistent that she take care of Jim herself. We were already strapped for cash, and Whitney's aunt was of no relation to Jim, so we really had no alternative. We would take shifts depending on who was working. Even though we have an apartment, we spent most of our time living at Jim's house. Whitney decided if Jim was going to die, he would die at home.
You would hate being stuck in the hospital,
He said.
At least this is where we shared a life together.
She was dead set on caring for Jim, despite the fact that neither of us were qualified to give him the care he needed. Even as Jim was losing his ability to walk, he liked to putter around when we went to get his food or medicine. One day, I came back from getting Jim's lunch when I noticed an open door adjacent to the living room. I put the plate down and went in. There was a wall covered in newspaper clippings, photographs, police reports, and other documents. There were red threads pinned into the wall, connecting some of the papers.
What you doing?
Jim asked from behind me. I turned and saw the old man propping himself up on the door frame.
The door was open. I was curious. I'm sorry. What is all of this, if you don't mind me asking?
My life's work.
Jim said. Jim collapsed under his own weight. I rushed over to help him. After a minute or two, I got Jim back on his feet and walked him over to his easy chair. I retrieved his lunch tray and placed it on a small table next to him.
Whitney told me you had a case that you were working on for years,
I said.
She also said you didn't want her to know too much about it.
No, I didn't. A little girl shouldn't know about such things. The Peeler killings, they were one of a kind.
How do you mean?
I asked.
The Peeler, that's what the papers called him, would flay his targets. Sometimes it was a potato peeler. Sometimes it was a knife. Sometimes he skinned them completely. Sometimes he only did an arm or a leg or the face. He always took something with him.
My stomach was churning and my mind was reeling.
What do you mean, take something?
Oh, teeth, bones, organs.
He stopped and looked around. I assumed he was looking for Whitney. Once he was satisfied she wasn't there, he leaned forward and spoke in a hushed tone.
Sometimes he took their genitalia. Sometimes he'd take the brains.
He sat back and spoke at his usual volume.
Department never caught the Peeler. For years I've been poring over that stuff, trying to see why the department never caught up to him. It's my life's work. I don't want Whitney to know anything about it, though. It's too much for her, and if she knew about things like that, it might just break her heart.
I nodded in agreement, wishing that I had never wandered into that office or asked questions in the first place.
Well, anyway,
Jim said.
The Peeler is still free. Who knows if they'll ever catch him? Maybe someday someone will look over my notes. Thanks for helping me off the ground. I used to be so strong. Now I'm just a weak old man.
Oh, don't say that.
Before I could finish my sentence, Jim erupted with laughter. Not just a chuckle, but the type that shakes your shoulders and need to catch your breath afterwards. His hands were shaking as he howled with laughter. I tried to calm him down. After a minute or two, he stopped laughing, but his hands were still shaking.
Jim, I think I should call an ambulance.
Nonsense,
He said, putting a gentle hand on my wrist.
I'm fine. I'm just going to eat now.
I watched him eat from the other room. Aside from his jittery hands, he seemed fine. Later that night, I told Whitney what had happened. She told me that she had seen him laugh like that the other day.
It's not just laughing,
She said.
He started crying the other day, really bawling out of nowhere.
I nodded and put a hand on her shoulder. Have you been noticing his mood swings too? I'm really getting worried about him. We scheduled appointments, but they were like a month off. Until you, he was the only person I had. Just don't want to lose him. I held her, her tears making my shoulder warm and wet. We were powerless to stop whatever was happening to him. From what little we knew, he was suffering from some sort of neurological disorder, maybe some form of dementia. By the following week, he was confined to a wheelchair. The week after that, he couldn't grasp anything. His laughing and crying fits were more frequent, and his speech had become slurred. We had to spoon feed him because he lost the capacity to hold anything. The next month, he stopped eating because he had so much trouble swallowing. He was admitted into the hospital after that. His muscles spasmed and his vision started to go. The doctors felt Jim had this neurological disease for at least a few months, if not a year. It shocked them that he hadn't slipped into a coma yet. Jim never did slip into a coma. A few weeks after his admission, he succumbed to pneumonia. Whitney was devastated. The doctors and nurses gave us their condolences. Then Whitney and I started managing the logistics of his death. The memorial service was held at the local funeral parlor. The owners remembered Jim as being larger than life. People from all over town were happy to help make this service a special one. Everyone except Whitney's aunt, that is.
It's better off this way, Whitney. You wouldn't want him to suffer, would you?
Her aunt asked. Compassion was a foreign concept to her aunt, but bullshit was her native language. Everyone at the service gave us their condolences and offered up anything you need. I think some of them even meant it. We went back to Jim's after the service. His ashes were placed in his office per his last wishes. I held Whitney and she started crying.
We have to clean this place out,
She said.
We can't afford to keep this place. It's like I'm losing him all over again.
She cried for a while, then went upstairs to sleep in her childhood room. When I checked on her, she was lying on the bed, wrapped in Jim's favorite blanket. I went downstairs to sleep on the couch in the living room. Then I stared at the ceiling until I finally started to doze off. After all, tomorrow we would start dismantling Jim's life piece by piece. I needed my rest. There was a large dumpster sitting in Jim's driveway. Mountains of boxes were strewn around the house. Some of them were to be donated, while others were headed for our apartment. We didn't have any money for storage space. Well-wishers would stop by to pick up donation boxes and make idle chit-chat. They would usually leave before they were asked to lend a hand. Nobody wants to clear a dead man's house. Day by day, we whittled away at the possessions in the house. The dumpster was almost overflowing, so I had to get on top of everything and stomp it down. The truck wouldn't pick up a dumpster that was overflowing after all. Everything that was meant to be donated was already picked up by the respective church or community groups that Jim wanted to help. All that remained was Whitney's room and Jim's office. We decided that she would clean out her childhood room and I would take care of Jim's office.
Please be careful,
He said.
That's his life's work in there.
We decided to eat before we got started.
Check the freezer out in the garage.
Whitney said. There was a large stainless freezer standing in the corner at the back of the garage. I opened the door and saw 2 sides of meat. I couldn't tell if it was beef or pork. The meat was wrapped in cellophane, but looked pretty freezer burned.
I think we're out of luck. There's only 2 sides of meat that are so freezer burned, I can't tell what they are. Even if we wanted them, it would take them until October to defrost.
Her face was wet with tears. I went over and hugged her.
Hey, the takeout in this town isn't that bad,
I said. She gave me a courtesy chuckle and sniffed.
It's not that.
He said.
I know.
We stood there for a minute or two, holding each other.
I'll tell you what,
I said.
How about I throw that old meat in the dumpster? I'll call the team and have them pick this behemoth up. Meanwhile, you take a walk or something. You need a break. Afterwards, pick up some Chinese food. Sound good?
She looked up at me and said,
Thank you.
I waved to her as she drove away, then headed back to the garage. The meat was heavier than a bag of rocks. I had to drag the first one on the ground. It took all of my might to get it into the dumpster. The other meat was just as heavy, so I decided to use the wheelbarrow to get it there. After getting the second side of meat into the dumpster, I needed to catch my breath. I called the dumpster company and told them we were ready for pickup. An hour went by before they showed. They thanked me for our business and went on their way. Pretty quick, all in all. The air conditioning was blasting inside. I sat down to cool off and get a drink of water. Jim's office was right across from me. There was something about that room, filled with its dark history, that made me uneasy. Didn't matter though. I needed to empty it out for Whitney. When I turned on the lights, I was greeted by decades of horror. Grisly crime scene photos and sensational news clippings decorated the office wall. There were red threads leading to missing person posters and coroner reports. I wondered if Jim was even allowed to have all of this information. Companies don't look kindly on employees who take home sensitive information. That probably goes double for police departments. It was easy to see why Jim considered this his life's work. This array of documents went beyond a passion for justice. It was more a sign of a dedicated obsession. I glossed over the papers as I removed them from the wall. Red thread would fall to the ground like leaves falling from a tree. Pins went straight in the garbage, while each document went into a specific box. According to the reports, the killings started off slow, maybe 1 or 2 per year. As the years went on, the peeler became more active. He started to strike every season, killing 2 to 5 people. There was no common thread I could see that linked the victims. After a few years, the killings started to taper off. The police weren't sure if it was because the peeler had moved, died, or simply tried to move on. Jim had made a note about cheetahs not changing their spots. Nevertheless, almost a decade had passed before the peeler killed again. Some of Jim's colleagues theorized that the peeler hid his victims during this time. Jim, however, noted that something else must have been going on in the peeler's life that curtailed his murders. After this lull, the peeler was back in full swing. He terrorized the county, killing up to 7 people a year. The increase in frequency was accompanied by an increase in brutality. Trophies would be taken from his victims. Small amounts of human flesh had been cooked at the scene of the crime. Just like Jim said, the peeler was taking teeth, bones, and other unsavory souvenirs. I filled up my first box of photographs but didn't have any spare boxes in the office. There was some up in Whitney's old room. All of her toys were already packed away. As I shifted some boxes to get to the spares, something fell to the ground and landed with a crack. I looked around the box and saw it was a wooden baby rattle. Jim probably made it for Whitney when she was born. I picked up the rattle and it looked like there was a small crack in it. I brought the rattle down with the spare boxes and took it to the kitchen. If I was lucky, Jim would have kept some wood glue around. I needed to finish clearing out the office, so I rested the rattle on the kitchen counter. Before I went in, I turned the temperature up so the AC didn't freeze me out. Back in the office, I gleaned more from the documents. The peeler had been busy, up until about a year and a half ago. His last suspected victims were a family of 4. Pieces of the family had been left behind, but it was suspected the peeler had absconded with the bodies. When the wall was cleared, I started on the desk. The documents there suggested that the peeler was a male, of large stature, and most likely of considerable strength. Coroner reports and psychological profiles filled the drawers of the desk. Profiles hypothesized a killer who most likely engaged in cannibalism in addition to taking trophies. Some of them suspected a full-on psychopath, while others suggested a methodical predator was hiding in plain sight. Additional reports offered further theories pertaining to the peeler's apparent cannibalism. Based on the killer's cannibalistic habit, some profilers suggested searching for people who exhibit symptoms of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. While extremely rare, the disease is noticeable to the trained observer. The only thing left to empty out was the bookshelf to the left of the desk. Most of the books were about police procedure and abnormal psychology. The rest of the books were about ritual killings, cannibalism, and other troubling topics. As I removed the last of the books, I noticed a slight draft coming from behind the bookshelf. I dragged the shelf over to the side and away from the wall. I expected to see a vent after I moved the shelf. Instead, I found a large hole in the wall. The hole was large enough for someone to crouch down and walk through it. Every bone in my body told me to drag the shelf back into place, but curiosity got the better of me. I took out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The hole had a passageway that led to a door. I opened the door to cold air and a stairwell that led into the basement. There was an acrid odor in the air. At the bottom of the stairs, there was a table covered in random objects. Some of the objects were valuable, such as watches and necklaces. The other stuff was random junk, like sticks of gum and pens. I followed the horrible smell. If there was a leak in the basement, Whitney and I would have to figure out how to repair it before we could even think about showing the house. When I turned the corner, I saw a large mass covered by a tarp. The closer I got, the more unbearable the stink was. By the time I was in arm's reach, I thought I was going to vomit. I stopped to gain my composure, then pulled the tarp away. Right as I was about to see what lied beneath, my phone powered down. In the rush to get moved out, I'd forgotten to charge it. The basement was pitch black. I backed into something that felt like a large shelf. There was a bunch of clinking and rattling, then something glass crashed onto the ground and broke open. The smell of formaldehyde filled the darkness. I found a wall and backed out all the way to the stairs. Once I was back in the office, I ran to the kitchen to find a flashlight. I opened every drawer and cabinet. Finally, I found a flashlight in the cabinet above the sink. As I reached the back of the cupboard to get it, I bumped into something and knocked it on the floor. It was the baby rattle I had left on the kitchen counter. Only this time, it didn't just crack, it broke. I knelt down to pick up the pieces. The crack from before had split open completely, and the handle had broken off. I knelt down to pick up the pieces. The crack from before had split open completely, and the handle had broken off. My heart stopped when I saw the contents that had spilled out of the rattle. 10 teeth had fallen out when the wood cracked open. I picked one of them up and examined it. It was a human molar. For a moment, I sat on the kitchen floor, my back against the lower cabinets. Why the hell was there human teeth in Whitney's baby rattle? My mind flooded with a million unbearable thoughts. I slowly got to my feet and made my way back to the hole in the wall. The stairs creaked underfoot, and the odors made me nauseous. I could make my way back by the smell alone, but I was glad for the path the flashlight cut through the darkness. A broken jar laid in the middle of the floor. Some spongy material sat in a puddle of liquid in the middle of the shards. I shined the light up to the shelf. Jars lined 4 rows of shelves. They were all filled with liquid, which I assume was all formaldehyde. Each jar had some sort of human offal floating within. Some of the jars had brain tissue, others digestive organs. There was 1 or 2 hearts and at least 5 bits that appeared to be genitalia. I stepped back and the flashlight revealed 2 tables at either side of the shelf. Each was decorated with an assortment of bones. Skulls, rib cages, femurs, and more were arranged in an almost ceremonial manner. I bumped into something when I took another step back. I was standing on the edge of the tarp I had pulled before. My hand shook as I reached out to grasp it. When I pulled it down, I revealed 4 carpets that had been rolled up. The unbearable odor was even worse now. The top carpet in the stack was slightly unfurled. Against my better judgment, I started to unroll it. As it opened, I could see what remained of a human hand. I decided to stop unrolling it and took a blind step back. There was a squishing sound under my feet, followed by the crunch of broken glass. I looked down to see I had stepped in the spongy stuff. While I was looking down, the carpet rolled downward, unfurling towards the floor. The full remains of a human being were now resting at my feet. Half of the torso appeared to have been cut off. My stomach rolled as I thought of the sides of mystery meat I had found in the freezer. I ran up the stairs, making my way to the back porch. After I got outside, I threw up in a flower bed. Sweat lined my brow and my head swam. All I could think about is how Jim told me that the wall in his office was his life's work. He said the department never caught the peeler, but never said he didn't catch him. This sweet old man, this inhuman monster, had been manipulating the investigation for years. He played on the heart and soul of his community. How many rattles around town had human teeth inside? Did his other woodworking projects have secret prizes inside? A few hours have gone by. I'm still sitting here on the porch. I can smell the summer heat cooking my vomit. My forehead is still covered in sweat, and my head is swimming. I've solved a mystery, decades in the making. I discovered a real-life monster, but I don't know what to do. Part of me wants to call the police, to blow this thing wide open. Deep down, there's another part of me, wondering what good that would do. Will exposing all of this bring anyone closure or peace? Will the victims magically come back to life? Or am I just going to tear a community apart? Am I going to destroy the memory of Whitney's guardian? She'll be home soon, and I'm torn. Do I expose a terrible truth to get justice? Or should I preserve a beautiful lie? Losing a loved one is never easy. Well, after taking some advice from people both online and offline, I made my choice on how I was going to tackle the locked door. The plan I decided to go with, for better or worse, was to let my stepdad and close friend of over 15 years know about the locked door. After telling them, the plan was a safe one in my opinion. We would take 2 double barrels I inherited from my father, some ammunition, a bright flashlight, and a phone for recording. Then we would go down there and find out what's what. I brought up the whole thing to my friend first, who was totally not into it. He is really squeamish when it comes to both medical stuff and anything hinting of the paranormal, so he told me I should call the cops and be done with it. I managed to convince him when I told him about the double barrels. Next, I called my stepdad on the phone. As I guessed, he didn't even mention being freaked out or even contacting the authorities. The first thing he wanted to do was barge through that door. I had to talk him out of going down there alone with no flashlight or protection. Eventually, I got him to agree to the plan. We all decided to go down there early Tuesday morning when my mom was at work. You see, my mom has several health conditions which require her to keep her stress levels low. She is already a worrywart, so we agreed not to tell her about any of this. My stepdad had no issue taking off work because he was 100% going to find out what was in his basement. As for my friend and I, we both had plenty of PTO to spare. The series of events I'm about to describe are a bit hazy, so forgive me. This whole thing was just absurd, and frankly, I've never felt so disturbed in my life. When traveling through the unfinished part of the basement to reach the crawl space, we heard noises, and quite a few of them. The first time I had explored, I had heard only just one faint sound. This time, what we heard was louder, and there were at least 5 occurrences. I don't remember the exact ratio, but it was a mix of scrapes, low tones, and light banging. I think they were similar to the noises I used to hear in my bedroom above, just sharper and more distinct. All 3 of us picked up on this, and my friend naturally wanted to turn back. I got him to keep going for now. When we reached the crawl space, I realized the floor was more damp than last time, and that weird odor I smelled was stronger. Whatever it was really smelled rotten, and it almost made my friend gag. It wasn't a normal rotting smell though. I can't really explain it, but there was something else in the smell that was almost otherworldly. Thinking back, maybe that dampness on the floor wasn't water after all. Anyway, we descended the staircase and reached the locked door. The only thing I remember clear as day about this whole thing was that the door had been tampered with since last time. Something had either opened it or damaged it from inside. I didn't tell my friend and stepdad this because I didn't want to turn around. We made it so far. My stepdad took the second key from his pocket and unlocked the door. Things get really weird from here on, unfortunately. It began with us going through the door and entering a corridor that was earthy and even more unfinished than the basement. This place didn't look like it belonged in the suburbs. The rotting smell was extremely strong, and my friend bailed out at that point, taking the recording phone back up the stairs with him. I was using my phone as our light source, since we forgot that bright flashlight I had mentioned, so I couldn't be recording. I know. My stepdad and I kept going for some unknown amount of time, down a series of dirty paths until we hit an open area. Visibility was bad there, and the smell was overwhelming. That's when my stepdad walked ahead of me into the dark. I think I tried to hold him on from going, but he just went right on. He went so far I couldn't see him or hear his steps. That open area must have been pretty large. After maybe a minute, I heard him abruptly call my name, yell out in pain, and fire his double barrel. It was then I heard something else. I'm honestly having trouble putting it to words, but I think it was like an inhuman shriek and an odd buzzing sound. The buzzing almost sounded like maybe a noisy ceiling light, and kept going after the shriek. My stepdad came back into the light of my phone, and I could see his forearm was bleeding from what I think was a claw wound or something. He told me something slashed him, but he thinks he hit it when he fired. We needed to get the heck out of there and call the police. As we ran out, I remember the buzzing sound was still going. It was almost like it filled the whole area and stopped once we closed the mystery door. At the top of the stairs, it was dead silence again. Everything that had just happened felt like a dream to me. We left the unfinished basement area and met my friend in the finished part. Turns out my buddy had already called the police and gave a lowdown because they showed up pretty fast after we fled. I informed them that after my friend had left us, we found some creature down there and my stepdad fired his gun after it attacked. They then had some paramedics come to bring him to the ER since his wound was bleeding quite a bit. A pair of cops went down to investigate after I outlined the schematics and told them where the hidden door was. Oddly, it almost felt like they might have already known about the door, but that just might be me reading things wrong. I gave them both keys and they went through the first door. About 30 minutes later, they came back and said there was nothing down there anymore, but they managed to collect a sample of what they called blood. They said they found it in an open, earthy room near some empty ammo shells. It was thick and dark, and like nothing I've ever seen before. Things once again got weird after the police wrapped up their report with us. They told my friend and I to not mention this whole ordeal to anyone in the press, and to make sure to tell the same to my stepfather. If we were needed any further, we would be contacted. Other than that, it would be best for us to just forget about all of this and, I quote, never enter that section of the basement again. Well, fast forward to Tuesday evening, and my mom was obviously informed of this whole thing after my stepdad went to the ER. She wasn't thrilled and now wants to move out ASAP. On top of that, she just called me earlier today, Wednesday, and told me a couple of suits showed up at their front door. They informed her that they were federal agents and they needed access to the locked part of the basement. They also said my parents may have to move out of the house and the feds would pay them for it in cash. How the feds knew about our situation, I'm not sure, but I assume the cops told them. Anyhow, my mom apparently let them go down there a couple of hours ago and they still haven't come back up yet. She went into my room to listen once they went through the first locked door, but never heard anything. This whole situation is honestly so screwed up at this point. I haven't slept well since this whole thing went down, and I have several questions with no answers. What happens if the agents don't come back up? Should I tell my parents to stay in a hotel or something? And most importantly, what the heck did my stepdad shoot at? I'm scared. Really scared. Edit. It's been another day or so. So, the more federal agents contacted my parents. The first two never came back up, and they decided to sell the home. Unfortunately, this means I will never be able to find out what was living in the basement. Maybe it's for the better though. I have a contact at the police station, and they told me that whatever that blood belonged to, they know for a fact it wasn't human, and it wasn't an animal. Take some advice from me. If you ever find a weird door in your home that you've never noticed before, don't open it. Apologies in advance for any typos or grammatical errors. I am typing this on my phone with my non-dominant hand. Everything happened recently, though it's still so vivid in my mind. My wife, Fallon, had never been camping before. We decided to go together for our 5-year wedding anniversary. It probably doesn't sound like the most glorious vacation for an anniversary, but we love the outdoors, and we figured it'd be a great break from our indoor desk jobs. The first couple of days we hiked, watched the stars, and relaxed together. We lived in the middle of the city, so we enjoyed seeing the tall blue spruces, the mountains, and smelling the fresh air. It was the perfect trip. Things started to go downhill today, the day before we planned on leaving. We decided to start our hike on a trail we had walked before and immensely enjoyed, planning to take a different fork this time. We were taking in the sights. We had started discussing moving out of the city so we could do things like this more often. We both worked from home, so it was a very real possibility, and we were engrossed in our conversation on the logistics of such a move that it took us about 20 minutes to realize we hadn't hit the fork in the trail yet. That didn't seem right, so I pulled up the picture of the trail map I had taken on my phone. According to the map, we should have reached it already. The trail we were supposed to be on split into a Y shape, so it would have been hard to miss. Instead, this trail continued straight on. It had been a couple of days since our first trek on that trail, so we figured we had just got disoriented and ended up on a different trail. It was a pleasant walk and seemed straightforward enough, so we figured we'd keep going and could easily find our way back. We kept going, taking in the sights, enjoying the soft breeze and the smell of the pines it brought with it. We walked on in silence, listening to the rustling of the wind in the trees and occasional sounds of small animals stepping through the fallen pine needles. We eventually heard rushing water and came to a small stream. It wasn't very wide, less than 4 feet. But the way the water moved, I guessed it was likely deeper than it looked. I dropped a small rock in out of curiosity. It was whisked straight down and away much faster than one would have guessed based on its appearance. Fallon nudged me. He pulled out the paper map from the park and pointed out this stream didn't show up on the map at all. We wondered if we had accidentally left the boundaries of the park. The trail looked well worn and safe. It wasn't as if we were wandering off into uncharted wilderness, so we decided to continue on and hoped we weren't trespassing. Due to the width of the stream, I just stepped over and put my hand out to help Fallon. But by the time I turned to where she had been standing, she had already cleared the distance in a graceful jump.
Show off,
I teased. She stuck her tongue out at me. We were fascinated by the sudden change in our surroundings on that side of the stream. The forest had taken on a new look. The trees were taller, closer together. They were older looking. As the density and height of the trees increased, the amount of light seeping through the canopy decreased immensely. Still, the trail continued on. I don't remember when the silence began. Was it after the stream or before? I only noticed it when a light mist set in and Fallon disappeared. I jumped. He had snuck behind me and whispered in my ear.
This would be the perfect setting for something to pop out of the woods and drag us away screaming.
I laughed.
Yeah, that'd make for one hell of an anniversary.
It was only after we stopped talking and the silence stood in stark contrast that I realized that we hadn't heard a single sound other than our own footsteps and breathing in a while. We eventually came to a clearing where there were no trees, no grass, just a small lake surrounded by dark soil. The difference in light between the dark, shadowed forest and the bright clearing had us blinking at the sudden return of the sun. The lake looked more like a crater in the black soil than water until a gentle breeze created waves. The water was so dark, but even more oddly, there was no reflection. Fallon, who was terrified of deep water, inhaled sharply and stepped backwards instinctively. I hadn't seen anything like it before, and I wanted to take a picture. I wanted to look online when we got home to see where we had ended up. It was fascinating. There weren't any footprints, human or otherwise, in the soil besides ours. I pulled out my phone and immediately dropped it on the ground. In the brief amount of time it took for me to bend down and retrieve it, wipe the black soil off the screen and lens, and stand back up, something in the atmosphere had shifted. The air was colder, and it was darker in the clearing. The sky had become cloudier. It had almost a greenish hue to it. The water was moving. Ripples emanated from the middle as something disrupted the otherwise calm water. Whatever it was coming up from under the surface. Something in me knew that whatever was coming out of there was not something we should stick around and see. I backed away, my mouth set in a grim line as I turned around to see if Fallon was seeing the same thing and I wasn't imagining it. She was staring at the lake as well, but with an expression I couldn't quite place at the time. Looking back now, I think adoration describes it best. Something almost human-shaped, but with long and thin spindly appendages, was coming from the water. It was matte black and almost difficult to distinguish from the water and soil in the low light, until it hauled itself further and began to crawl. Didn't know what it was, but my prey instincts told me I did not want to be here when it fully emerged to find out. The non-rightness of it had my skin crawling. I reached for Fallon's hand, but it slipped through my fingers. He was jogging towards it before I even realized what was happening. And then, my wife did something that shocked me. She reached down, helped it the remaining way out of the water and to its feet. She began talking to it quickly, excitedly, and leading it towards me. My brain was still trying to process the turn of events. I wasn't entirely sure what I was seeing. If I had been alone, I would have bolted in the opposite direction, but I couldn't leave her. I stood frozen in place, poised to dart forward to grab her away from it, but she was still holding on to it. Fallon had one of its long, thin appendages draped over her shoulder. She approached, holding it as if it were an injured hiking partner.
Jordan,
She said, her eyes misty.
this is my roommate, Katie, from college.
She patted it on what would have been a shoulder had it been entirely human-shaped.
Katie, it's been so long.
She gestured toward me.
This is my husband, Jordan.
I stood there dumbfounded. I was frozen, my stomach heavy with a sort of fear I can't describe, other than the feeling of seeing something human eyes were probably not meant to see. I feel like you don't need me to tell you this, but I just want to confirm it to you that there is no way in hell that thing was Katie. I had met Katie before, and she was an actual living human being. We were even friends on Instagram. According to her recently posted pictures, she was living in Cape Cod, not visiting the bottom of a lake in the middle of nowhere several states away. When my brain and mouth finally started working again, all I could bring myself to say was,
Honey, I don't think that's...
But before I could think of how to even finish my sentence, I noticed that where the thing rested on her shoulder, the delineation of where her arms and shoulders ended and its body began seemed less crisp somehow. I hoped it was a trick of the light, but the observation stirred me out of my stupor. I became more insistent.
Fallon, I need you to get away from that, please. I don't know what you're seeing, but that isn't Katie.
I said it as calmly as I could. I thought that maybe if I reasoned with her, it'd snap her out of whatever delusion she was trapped in.
Please, remember where we are. Why would she be out here? Why would she crawl out of a lake?
She looked at me, indignant.
You want me to leave her here on her own? Injured?
I had to rack my brain a bit, but then I did recall a story about how Katie had injured her leg and would be the first and last time the two of them went skiing. Fallon had helped her get back to the lodge. This had been years and years ago, long before we were even dating. Was she reliving this moment? I didn't know what to do. She was latched onto that thing like it was her best friend, literally. She looked at me with that fiery determination in her golden eyes that I usually loved about her, but in this case, it had me worried for her life.
All right,
I eventually said, warily. It hadn't attacked her, or really moved at all since it emerged, and I wanted to get us away from the lake as soon as possible before anything else crawled out of it. I didn't see any choice but to continue back the way we came. I led us back along the path to the stream, glancing over my shoulder every so often at her and the thing. She was having a one-sided conversation with it about a different friend, laughing as if it had told her a joke. When she caught me staring, she narrowed her eyes at me. I tried to see what she was seeing, but I couldn't. When we reached the stream, about after 15 minutes, I stepped across it, same as before. I turned to Fallon, unsure of what to do. She had stopped and was staring at me. Against my better judgment, I held out my hand.
Fallon, I'll get her across so you can jump,
I whispered. She ignored me, and instead she continued on, putting one foot into the stream as if she didn't see it there at all. Luckily, it seemed to surprise her, because she jolted back before she could have put her full weight on it and fallen in. She stumbled back, as if surprised, shook her head like she was trying to awaken from a daydream.
What?
Her annoyed look had instantly changed to one of confusion.
What's happening? How did we get back here already? Where's Katie?
The confusion quickly gave way to fear. The blood drained from her face. She had turned her head and seemed to be seeing the thing draped over her shoulder for what it was now. She was just now feeling the primal terror I had felt when I saw it emerge from the water. She was trying to push it off her violently. She was panicking, struggling, screaming, shattering the silence.
I can't get off!
Her eyes pleaded with me. I jumped back over to help.
Jordan, please.
She begged, her voice hoarse from screaming. I tried to help pull the thing off her, but wherever she had touched it, it was as if it had absorbed her into its own body. My breathing was frantic. I was trying to tell her it'd be okay, telling her to stay calm, while clearly not doing so myself. Suddenly, she started slowly moving away from me. Her eyes were full of confusion and fear. The thing, now that it was attached to her fully, had begun to move away from me slowly and dragged her with it. Our eyes met as we realized it was taking her back where we came from, towards the dark water. I grabbed her hand, pulled her towards me, putting all of my weight into it. For as thin and spindly as it was, it still managed to pull her strongly in the opposite direction.
Please, Jordan,
She sobbed, her voice cracked.
please don't let it take me.
Suddenly, the thing relented a bit, and without its resistance, I fell backwards into the water. All three of us were yanked in by the force of my fall and the current. I watched helplessly as she struggled to stay above water. I'll never forget the look on her face, one of abject terror, as the thing pushed me away from her and she was swept away. When I finally caught on to something along the shore and managed to pull myself out, I was coughing up water. I wasn't sure where I was. My phone was soaked, the maps were gone, but my first thought was Fallon. I ran, screaming her name as dusk began to settle. Somehow, I found her. She was sitting against a tree, hugging herself, her eyes wide with shock. But to my immense relief, she was alive, and the thing was gone. She looked like her normal self, albeit traumatized a bit. I held her, told her we were okay. We were going to be okay. We'd made it. We decided to head straight to the car and leave, rather than wander around in the dying light, trying to find our campsite. We'd come back for our gear later. We walked back towards the car, her hand in mine. But the thing is, now I can't let go of her hand. Every time I close my eyes, I can see that game. Its bright screen burned into my vision whenever my eyelids drop. It was the summer of 1982 in Oregon, and I was like any other college freshman. I would go to parties, play sports, and most importantly, I had to work a summer job to pay for rent. But unlike some, I actually loved my job. I worked at an arcade and enjoyed every second of it. Even with the small payment I received every week, it filled my summer with unforgettable memories that I still remember today. But after a while, I will admit it got pretty stale, and after mastering most of the games, my boredom continued to grow. That is, until the day when a new game that would change my life appeared in the corner of the arcade. I stepped into the arcade and immediately was hit with a wave of cold air and with all the lights and games turned on. It was very strange because I remember so well turning everything off the night before. I had just assumed that my boss had come in before me and set up for me. So I began to work when I noticed a black and green arcade cabinet in the corner of the arcade. It had big emerald letters on the top that spelled out Polybius. Everything seemed to slow down when I noticed it, and my peripheral vision became blurry. I then heard a muffled voice that sounded like, "What ain't it at?" The weird vision stopped, and I heard, "I said, what game is that?" coming from a kid next to me. "Oh, sorry kid, I have no idea," I said back to him as he started to walk away. The rest of the day was spent working in the same way as usual, but every once in a while I would catch glimpses of that machine with a long line behind it. A couple of times I had to break up fights that began because of arguing about whose turn it was to play. Eventually, it was closing time, but the people there all wanted to stay and play Polybius. I started telling them to go when I saw most of their eyes were dilating weirdly, most likely due to the game. But my boss said it was okay if they stayed another hour or so I had to wait for these kids to finish their game. And even when I told them it was past closing time and they needed to leave, they still argued with me. Eventually, though, I was able to make them leave. I was just about to leave myself when I noticed Polybius sitting there, its neon lights beckoning. For me? I walked up to the machine, the only one somehow still on, and decided to see what the hype was about, maybe figure out why people loved to play it so much. So I dug in my pocket and found a quarter. I only had one, so I'd have to make it count. I slid it into the machine, and the game began. Kind of hard to explain exactly what the game was like, but I can say it was special. It felt perfect, but my perfect, like it was made for me. All the sounds, shades, controls. I can't explain how or why this happened, but it definitely made it an enjoyable experience. Although, there was one problem. It kind of gave me a headache. But I continued to play until I died. I grunted and punched the screen. I had never really gotten mad about dying in games, but this was different. I then looked at my watch and was shocked to find out I had been playing for almost half an hour. It had only felt like a couple of minutes. I decided it was time to go home and get some rest, but even when I was home, I couldn't stop thinking about Polybius. I had an uncontrollable urge to play that game, and even when I finally fell asleep, I began dreaming about it. I woke up and I knew I needed to play that game, so I grabbed the keys and drove up there. I walked in and checked my watch. 2:37 it said. This time, I brought 6 quarters so my enjoyment would be extended. I walked up to the machine with excitement, its green light wrapping around me. I looked to the bottom of the screen. I slid in a quarter and began playing. Perfection. Just like last time. I kept putting in the quarters over and over again. That's when everything went black. I woke up to the sight of my boss and his terrified face. I got up and he began asking me questions and saying something about how I looked terrible. Anger began to grow in me, and I started cursing at him and telling him that he was a greedy dirtbag that doesn't know anything. After that day, I tried to apologize to him several times, but we never really interacted much after that. After yelling at him, I walked into the bathroom and saw that I looked like I was almost dead. I had dark circles around my bloodshot eyes, and I had saggy skin. My pupils were also like the kid from yesterday's. I stepped out of the bathroom and felt sick. I was sure the game would help, but until then I would be forced to work. I did my job mostly as usual, but my eyes would always drift to the cabinet. It was almost painful waiting for the shop to close, but I was able to get through it. Finally, night came, and after kicking the customers out, all I had to wait for was for my boss to leave. But right at the time he usually left, he told me he would lock up for the night. I tried to insist that I should do it, but it was no use. He also revoked my keys because of what I did earlier, which meant that I would need to find another way in. I waited in the shadows for him to leave, and when he did and was out of eye's view, I ran up to the arcade and began searching for ways to get in. But everything was locked. I had only one option left. I grabbed a large rock and threw it through the window. Glass splashed everywhere, and I climbed in. I fell to the ground and saw it, standing there, Polybius. I had spent all my quarters, so I resorted to something I wouldn't normally do. I opened up Pac-Man and took out the container of quarters from it. I began putting quarters in and playing the game. As always, it was amazing. Everything else was trivial. Eventually, it seemed like I was in a black void, just playing the game and experiencing its wonder. But then, the game disappeared, and I noticed that I was in a green wireframe hall. It had poorly rendered torches. I began walking through it till I arrived at a large door. With nothing else to do, I opened it and walked through. There was a throne, and on it, a jumbled mess of the emerald rods encircling it, small green figures. I began hearing weird sounds, and the thing on the throne grinned with sharp teeth. It reached out, with what I can only assume was a hand at the time. It touched me, and I began running out through the hall. As I dashed out, I saw that parts of my body began turning into bright green wireframe. As I was sprinting, I saw my entire ring finger had been consumed. The world began deteriorating and crumbling, and then, white. I woke up and noticed I was missing my finger and multiple patches of skin. I looked at my watch. 4:29, it said. I ran out of the arcade and never looked back. Now, 40 years later, I live in Maine and I'm haunted by that game. I don't know if it still exists or not, but if you see Polybius in your arcade, please, I beg you, leave immediately. Because the second your quarter goes through the slot and starts the game, there's no turning back. I can't make any of this up. None of my friends or family will believe me. They think I'm dreaming. You all will believe me, right? I'm so scared, shocked, guilty, confused. 3 nights ago, I went to the psych ward with a group of camp members to volunteer in visiting the kids that were there, to give them some money that we raised. When we arrived, the nurse assigned me room 93. Inside, there was a girl that was very lonely. She told me that the girl was horribly ill, and they couldn't do anything to save her. They left her to her fate, and didn't bother visiting often as it was pointless. I felt bad and went in. Room 93 was very vacant. No nightstand, no rug, no comfort, just gray walls, a small window with a boring view of the rooftop next door, a chair in the corner of the room, and a hospital bed with many machines and heart monitors. And in the bed, there she was. I didn't know her name, but we talked, even if I was too afraid to at first. She told me things like how when nobody was with her, nothing mattered, but when I was there, something did. She also hated being alone, how she was a prisoner to this ward and her fate, how she wished she was free. She also told me about how when people visit, it's not often she will see them again, and how heart-wrenching it is to see them walk out the door while she just lies there. And that's how her abandonment issues started. She begged me to please not leave, even after visiting hours. I couldn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. I felt as if I was too afraid to speak. So I only nodded at her request and sat in the chair that was provided at the corner of the room for many hours until it was time to go. There were very few moments when I would stand and go to her. At one point, she would talk about how loneliness got to her and how she was always afraid of people visiting because she knew they'd leave. Once again, she begged me not to leave and that she didn't want to die alone. I could only nod again. I felt horrible for her. A young teenager, so ill to the point no nurse nor doctor would go in and check on her. Her fate was actually sealed. There was no way out, even if there was a tiny chance. It was impossible. The only thing for her to progress was to die. I stayed for 4 to 5 more hours until I understood why the other visitors had left and how the girl felt. My entire camp had left me here in this hospital. I guess they forgot about me. I'd have to walk home. I was getting sick and bored of staying here, and every time I walked up to the girl, she would only ask me not to leave, and I'd nod. It was a loop, and sometimes it felt like I was the one being abandoned in my deathbed, and not her. I didn't want to leave her, but I couldn't stay forever. Another hour had passed until I finally got up and went to the door. And she immediately called to me, asking where I was going and begged me to stay. It was too much. I couldn't say anything to her. I didn't want to. Cold sweat ran down my face as I grabbed for the handle, and she continued to beg me not to leave. She mentioned not wanting to die alone again, and I only heard a slight, "I'll miss you," as I left. But those were the last words I heard from her before I left the room. When I came outside, the lights of the entire hospital were still on. My eyes flashed with colors as I had been sitting in a nearly dark room for hours, newly adjusting to the brightness. I noticed 2 of the nurses giving me looks of pity and unreadable discomfort, but they immediately walked away once I looked back at them. I was too tired to question it, so I just went for the front door and walked home until my feet felt like they were about to fall off. That night when I finally returned home, everything hit me at once. The guilt for leaving the girl there to her fate, as if she already wasn't dying. The thought of her having no one. The thought of her just being in that empty room. The opportunities she would have had if she never got sick. I decided I'd return to her the next day. Part of me wanted to get her out of there, but that part of me instantly shattered when I realized that just wasn't possible. I could barely sleep that night. All I could think about was the guilt and shame I had of leaving her. It was overwhelming, and if she was going to die alone because I couldn't tolerate just falling asleep in a chair and staying until morning, I would be absolutely furious with myself. I managed to get a few hours of sleep, but at 6 in the morning, I woke up and rushed to the ward again. The receptionist only gave me a weird, disgusted look at why I was in such a panic. I explained to her I needed to go to room 93 as soon as possible, and that I would be visiting every day from now on. The receptionist stared at me as if I was a bug, and I wanted to rush her even more until she told me something I'll never forget.
Sir, there is no room 93 here.